Look, I know better than to pick a fight with the legions of Tesla fans out there who believe the brand, and yes, its boss, can do no wrong, so I'm going to choose my words carefully. As a brand, there's no denying that Tesla has done incredible work to advance electric vehicle adoption over the years, and its battery tech is still the kind of black magic that the rest of the industry is trying to master. But it was only a matter of time before other automakers started to deliver EVs that were compelling in their own ways. Case in point, the EQS SUV from Mercedes. No, it doesn't quite have the range of the Tesla Model X, but it isn't that far off either. More importantly, though, it feels every bit of its six-figure price tag. For more expert car reviews, don't forget to share our channel and subscribe so you can catch some of this and maybe even a little of that. Right, so price is probably a pretty good place to start. And this thing starts at $136,000 for the EQS 450. And then this one I'm driving is the EQS 580 SUV, which starts at $158,500. It's no coincidence that that's not too far off the Tesla Model X, which is priced between about $140,000 and $160,000 here in Canada. Obviously, depending on options, there's those different advanced safety and driver assist packages. Just like this thing, you can get a bunch of options. This one, it has $27,500 worth of extras. That is a lot of money. And it pushes the asking price of this thing to $186,000 before tax. And I'm not here to pretend that that's good value in the traditional sense, but as far as seeing and feeling what you're getting for the money, it is absolutely apparent no matter where you're looking or where you're sitting. And some of the extras here are super cool. You've got this great augmented reality head-up display system that I like way more than I thought I would. It's got massaging front seats that I like just as much as I thought I would. Twin touchscreens in the back. There are some cool standard features too. There's a voice assistant. Hey Mercedes,
How can I help?
tell me a joke.
A sandwich walked into a bar. The bartender told him, "I'm sorry, but you'll have to leave. We don't serve food here."
Classic Mercedes. But forget that gimmick for a second and just focus on that overall sense of luxury, because yes, the Model X, it's undeniably modern, but there's just not the same attention to detail, features, and opulence. This thing is undeniably more luxurious. And again, when you're looking at their price points, they're not too different. And if you want to spend the money and see what you're getting, it's just hard to argue with the package here. Now, one area that the Model X is absolutely winning the battle is when it comes to range, because that thing can cover anywhere from 499 to 565 kilometers, depending on the trim and the packaging. 5 passenger, 6 or 7, all that stuff affects weight, which affects how far it can travel between charges. Well, with this thing, no matter whether you're talking about the EQS 450 or the 580, both can cover an estimated 459 kilometers, which isn't a ton. You know, that's less than I would like to see in an EV, but it does seem pretty accurate. I did a bit of a range test, not a full-blown one, but I decided to drive down to Niagara Falls the other day to the Sir Adam Beck hydroelectric facility. Massive hydro facility. It's got a huge reservoir. It's technically one of the largest energy storage facilities in Canada because it's just a big pool of water that feeds that dam. When you need to feed a little bit more power into the grid, just let a little bit more water in. Anyways, drove down there, 200 kilometers, and I burned through exactly 50% of the battery. And when you think about that, it's not too bad. It means, yeah, this thing effectively lost 59 kilometers of range, but don't forget, all EVs, well, they go through energy quicker on the highway than they do around town. So the fact that this thing only lost 59 kilometers really isn't that bad. If you take a look at that Chevy Bolt EUV that I did the range test in not too long ago, well, that thing was burning through energy at a rate of 2 to 1. For every kilometer that I drove, it was losing 2 kilometers of range. So the fact that this thing didn't do that, and it was cold, it was rainy, pretty miserable, I am impressed. I'm also impressed with the charging times because I hooked up to a 150 kilowatt charging station, and it only took me an hour to go from 35% to a full charge. And don't forget, that last 20% of the battery does take the longest. The analogy that I always use is charging an EV. It's like filling an ice cube tray. It's easy to get water down in all of the pockets, but if you want them all to be filled to the same level, well, that takes the longest for the water to kind of hunt its way around. Same thing goes with the energy in a battery pack. It's got to find all those empty cells. So that's why that last 20% takes the longest. And really, an hour, not that far off the mark that Mercedes pegs this thing to do on a 200 kilowatt charge, which is the maximum the EQS can handle. Mercedes says it'll take about 37 minutes in ideal conditions to go from 10 to 80%. So considering I went from 35 to 100 in only about an hour on a cold and miserable day, that's not too bad. Now, that battery pack is massive. It's 107.8 kilowatts. And then this is one of those typical dual motor setups that you'll find in most all-wheel drive EVs. It's got one up front for the front wheels, one electric motor in the back for the rear. Makes a lot of sense. This one makes 516 horsepower and 632 pound-feet of torque because it's the 580 version. The 450 makes a little less. Can't remember the numbers, but they don't really matter. This thing is very smooth, very easy to adjust to driving to an EV. And it does have the stuff you'd expect, like regenerative braking. And it's cool that you adjust it using these paddles on the steering wheel. So you pull this one on the right if you want to shut it off or lessen the regeneration, and then pull the one on the left for maximum regen. But I do have to say, it's not quite as strong as I would like to see. Now, in most scenarios, you can just let your foot off the throttle and it will bring it to a halt. But it's not quite as good as the system in something like the Ford Mustang Mach-E. I've driven a couple of those now, and I really like how aggressive the regen is. Whereas this thing, if you're coming up on a light and it turns yellow and you need to stop, well, you can't rely on the regenerative braking. You're probably going to need to lean into those mechanical brakes just a little bit, but I'd say probably 95% of the time, you never even have to touch the brake pedal. And that is pretty handy. It's one of those party tricks that's great to see. It's also great to use. It's a nice way to put a little energy back in the battery and kind of challenge yourself. And that to me is way more fun. I don't know, the novelty of sprinting away from a stop in a hurry, that wears off pretty quickly, but challenging yourself to drive efficiently as possible, that's really cool. That's what keeps me coming back. That's one of the things I've grown to love about driving EVs, and it's great to see that here too. Now, there are a bunch of different drive modes too, including, of course, an eco setting, and given what I just said, probably no surprise that that is my preferred mode. I do have to say though, kind of an odd sensation. There's a bit of resistance in the pedal, especially on the highway. It's like it gives you that second chance. Do you really want to burn more energy than necessary? It also makes it very easy to cruise at a constant speed, even with the regenerative braking in its strongest setting, which is rare. Usually you're going to run into an issue in an EV where that regenerative braking is going to be so aggressive that it's harder to keep it moving at a constant speed. But this one I find very easy to do that. And then again, it just needs a little bit of a heavier stab of the throttle if you really do want to add speed on the highway. But again, that's great if you're trying to drive as efficiently as possible. And then as far as smoothness, the standard air suspension in this thing, it's just so supple. Very rarely do you feel all the weight and rigidity of that battery pack down low underneath the passenger cell. Overall, it's just properly luxurious, nicely balanced, super serene, pretty quiet in here. There's also a ton of tech, and as I'm sure you noticed, there's the massive hyperscreen in this one I'm driving. Now, that's a $9,900 option in the EQS 450, and it's standard in the 580, and it gives you something like 56 inches of screen. It is ridiculous. Now, technically, it's 3 separate screens up here. It's just under one panel of glass. So you have this instrument display in front of you. You've got this massive 17.7-inch touchscreen. Yes, that's slightly bigger than the Model X's, and no, I don't think that's a coincidence. And then you have this separate screen in front of the passenger. It's really cool. And again, like I talked about earlier, this one does have those screens in the back, as well as the screen on the back of the console for climate control, and that removable tablet in the center console. There's a whole lot going on, but just focusing on the screen up here, it can be a little overwhelming. It's good, it's user-friendly, but I do find it to be just a little bit confusing at times when you're trying to do something in a hurry. It's almost like it's been oversimplified. So even switching to Apple CarPlay, for instance, you can't do that using voice commands. There is this little tiny icon in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, but it's hard to see that at a glance. There's no proper menu as the sort of home screen like there usually is, or like there is on this passenger side screen or the ones in the back. The map is the default, and that means you have to hit this home button if you want to pull up this menu. It does take some getting used to, but I do have some praise for Mercedes when it comes to this infotainment system. Finally, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto occupy almost the entire screen. You can see just a little bit of a border around them, but way better than some of those other ones I've tested where there were those big black bars on either side of those wide screens. And the graphics, they look amazing. I also want to talk about that augmented reality head-up display again. I know I touched on it earlier, but it is super cool because you have the normal information you would expect, but if you have directions plugged into the navigation system, you get these massive arrows right in front of you projected on the road, which means even the most directionally challenged drivers out there, like my friend and your favorite co-host, Jody Lai, well, they're never going to miss their destinations or turns again. It also works when you have the self-lane change functionality set up with the adaptive cruise control. It means it can change lanes on its own, and it gives you these massive green arrows to let you know that the system is working. There's nothing worse than these systems where there's only very subtle hints that something's happening. You got to look for little arrows down in the instrument cluster or just do it by feel. This thing, you know exactly what's happening. Activate the signal. If the lane beside you is clear, it'll start to move over, and these arrows actually adjust to show you that it's making the lane change, and then when it's complete, that is very cool. And again, there's just that air of luxury and opulence, really modern, lots of cool tech in here. There's also about 12 different leathers to choose from and a few different trims, including this open pore ship's deck wood that I think looks fantastic, especially with this very light gray and blue leather. That blue leather is a nice tie-in with this blue paint that isn't too flashy, and neither is the rest of the exterior. Generally speaking, this thing has a pretty normal presence, and it doesn't necessarily look like an EV from afar. And that's a big selling point in my eyes, because not everyone wants what they drive to look weird or stand out too much in a parking lot. Now, there are some cool styling elements here, like this strip of LED lights, as well as this black plastic panel up front that has this TriStar logo pattern embedded right into it on the EQS 580. Very cool, but also very classy. Something else I really like about the EQS SUV is just how easy it is to climb on board with these massive doors and chunky handles. And once you're inside, well, it's pure luxury, both front and back. Right, Will? To recap, I like how opulent the Mercedes EQS SUV is, the extras this one's got, like the AR head-up display, and how easy it makes the transition to electrification. I don't like the imperfect interface, the finicky touch sensors, or that it doesn't have just a bit more range. Just to reiterate, I'm not here to slam the Tesla Model X or its owners, and I know that thing has its merits. What it really comes down to for me is what the EQS SUV delivers for similar money. It leaves very little to be desired, which is exactly what it should do at this price point. Either way, I'm sure we can all agree that variety is a good thing, even when it comes to six-figure EVs, and it's great to see a brand like Mercedes finally rising to the challenge.